And while the president remains overseas, we are getting some new polling, actually, on how Americans feel about the NATO alliance. According to a new Pew Research poll, a majority of Americans still approve of NATO, but that number has dropped by 5 points in the past year. Recent polling also shows that while support for aiding Ukraine remains high, it appears to be in decline. For more, let's bring in ABC's Galen Druke. So, Galen, why do you think Americans aren't as hot on NATO as they used to be? And what could Biden do maybe on this trip to increase Americans' confidence in the alliance?
Yeah, so part of what's happening here is that the Ukraine invasion has faded from the headlines a little bit since last year. So last year, 67% of Americans said they approved of NATO. Today, it's 62%. So that's dropped by 5 percentage points, although, as you mentioned, overall, a majority of Americans still support it. So as Ukraine has faded in terms of salience for Americans, we've seen that. But there's another piece going on here as well, which is that under Trump's administration and when he campaigned in 2016, he increasingly, doubted some of the relevance of NATO for Americans and criticized member nations for not doing their fair share in terms of, contributing parts of their budget to defense. And so he has convinced some Republican voters, perhaps, that NATO isn't as useful as Americans once thought it was. So we're seeing two things at once. One, Ukraine fading in general from the headlines, and two, Americans being a little bit skeptical about how much other nations are putting into the defense alliance. Now, if Biden wants to turn that around, what can he do? I think first and foremost, he can explain to Americans why the invasion of Ukraine and Russia's aggression here is pertinent to Americans' lives. This may not feel so present in people's lives because it's far away. So explain why, if he believes it is, so important to American defense. Explain that to Americans. The other thing that he would want to do is try to showcase that in recent years, European nations have increasingly given parts of their budget to the NATO alliance. We have seen that increase.
So 56 of Americans approve of President Zelensky, but Republicans are growing increasingly skeptical of U.S. aid to Ukraine. So break down those numbers for us.
Yeah, when you ask broadly Americans, do you think that the United States should stand with Ukraine as long as it takes, or do you think they should try to resolve this conflict as soon as possible, even if it means that Ukraine gives some of its territory to Russia? You see the breakdown being something like 60-some% of Americans say as long as it takes, 30-some% of Americans say that we should try to accelerate the end of this, even if it means Ukraine has to give some territory to Russia. Most of the skepticism on this issue that we see is coming from Republicans. So when this conflict first began, only about 9% of Republicans said the U.S. is contributing too much aid to Ukraine. Now that number is at 44%. And part of what we're seeing is that, former President Trump and others running in the Republican primary are questioning, how relevant this is to Americans' lives. We heard from Trump himself saying that the U.S. is giving too much aid to Ukraine. And we also heard from Governor of Florida, Ron DeSantis, who said this is not in America's vital interests. And so we see a differential there. In general, Democrats and Americans overall still support the levels of aid that we're giving, though.
So what does the polling tell us about how Americans view the war as it's changing and also continues to drag on?
It's a good question. So far, Biden and the Democrats have been on the right side of public opinion on this issue. Americans give Biden better marks on his handling of Ukraine than they do overall, and better marks than they give him on handling something like the economy. However, if this drags on for years and years and years, we have seen over the past year declining interest from Americans. And if that trend continues, Biden may not be able to convince Americans over the long term to keep spending at the aid levels that they're doing, which so far has been $75 billion.
Galen Druke, appreciate the numbers and the intel. Thank you.
Of course.
Hi, everyone. George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking out the ABC News YouTube channel. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch live event coverage, click on the right over here to subscribe to our channel. And don't forget to download the ABC News app for breaking news alerts. Thanks for watching.